Hello and welcome to a video on the fifth topic of the first IB biology topic, cell biology, which is the origin of cells. So first of all, I'll talk about the first cell theory, as well as the endosymbiotic theory, which is the most popular and highly esteemed theory of the first cells and what the origin of cells actually is. Then I talk about biogenesis and the differentiation between abiogenesis and biogenesis, as well as the origins of life in this so-called biogenesis. And lastly, I'll also talk about the RNA World hypothesis. So yes, I hope you enjoy. And let's get on with it. Starting with the first cells. The theory includes that first cells must have originated from pre-existing chemicals because everything on Earth, such as energy and chemicals, are not made from thin air, or they may be made from air, but if you know what I mean, they're not just coming into existence. They must have evolved from some sort of pre-existing material, chemical in this case. And furthermore, living things are made up of simple organic molecules, and single molecules have been assembled to complex structures to make the complex cells and multicellular organisms that we have today. Molecules also formed so that they could replicate themselves on the basis of inheritance, and the mixtures of molecules enclosed in membrane-bound vesicles. And there's also the theory of common ancestry, which includes that the ancestry of an organism on Earth can be tracked down back to one common ancestor, the so-called LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. And on the basis of molecular evidence and morphological comparisons, there may be an identifiable origin, and the evidence for that is the commonality in the genetic code and the similarity to molecular machinery of cells. And also because we have the same combination of DNA bases, so we have the 4 DNA bases. And if you want to know more about the DNA acids, I'll talk about that in the new series on molecular biology. Yes. Moving on, we have the endosymbiotic theory, and it's basically the origin of eukaryotes and how eukaryotic cells could have developed from simple cells, and the organelles inside the eukaryotes were only once prokaryotes, but organelles are, the theory says that there was this ancestral prokaryote, then the infolding of the plasma membrane, and the cytosis of this prokaryote into another prokaryote, this endosymbiosis, which then became the organelles of this ancestral eukaryote. So a big prokaryotic cell ate or absorbed a small prokaryotic cell in an assembly, and then the most cells have membrane-bound prokaryotic cells that duplicate with binary fission. And yes, this phagocytosis is the process in which the organelles are modified bacteria and were taken in by the bigger cell. And that is because the double outer envelope of mitochondria and chloroplasts originated from bacterial plasma membrane and the membrane of the engulfing phagocytic vesicle. The bacteria carried pigment molecules on membranes and used light energy to create organic molecules and release oxygen, which may explain chloroplasts. And the evidence for that is that these aforementioned important cells, such as the mitochondria and chloroplasts, are similar to prokaryotic cells in that they have ribosomes similar to bacteria, circular DNA resembling plasmid, and own plasmid and membrane, and that they can duplicate by binary fission. Although there is the criticism that it is not certain that they could replicate well through binary fission and division on their own, and these isolated organelles. So if you were to isolate a mitochondrium or a chloroplasm, could not survive on their own. And then there's this question if that is a proof that they were once not independent cells, but rather that they may have evolved to be codependent on the eukaryote as a whole. So yes, that is the basics of the endosymbiotic theory. Next we come to biogenesis, and biogenesis is the chemical process contributed to formation of biological life under specific conditions. So living cells can be created independently by abiogenesis or the non-living matter genesis, which you can see on the right side, but that is because conditions don't exist on modern Earth that would facilitate abiogenesis. And so biogenesis says that cells would come through the division of pre-existing cells. And that was actually made clear by an experiment by Louis Pasteur, who grew bacteria because of contamination with pre-existing cells. That means that there would be no spontaneous regeneration of cells, so bacteria would only grow because there were pre-existing cells and not the other way around. And then we have abiogenesis, which is the counter theory to biogenesis, and that is the theory that living cells came from non-living matter, and this non-living synthesis of simple organic molecules can be said that they have been assembled to more complex polymers and form the capacity to self-replicate to some extent. And the molecules are packaged into membranes with protobions. And this was made by the Miller-Urey experiment. This theory was created by the Miller-Urey experiment, which is also in counter to Louis Pasteur's experiment. This shows that science most often does not have one answer for one specific matter, but rather one that is more widely accepted but equally as grounded in science as others. And continuing on for biogenesis, there's also the theory of the origin of life for the biogenesis theory. So we have the initial formation of protocells, so-called protocells, the cells that were before the actual cells, through a specific chemical environment that most likely existed on early Earth, that had chemically reducing atmosphere that produces organic compounds or monomers that were then made to polymers when exposed to energy. There's also the factor of temperature through volcanoes, hydrothermal vents, and so on and so forth, but there's also the theory of the origin of life stemming from extraterrestrial origins, which is quite interesting if you think about that. We also have the so-called RNA world, and here are the steps that would come about for this so-called RNA world hypothesis. It's still only a hypothesis. So RNA can self-replicate and act as a catalyst and act as a vehicle for information storage. So first of all, RNA forms from inorganic sources and then self-replicates with ribozymes. The RNA catalyzes then the protein synthesis, and the membrane formation changes the internal chemistry and leads to new functionality. So the RNA codes both DNA and the protein. And as you can see, then proteins catalyze cellular activities and DNA becomes the master template, so anything stems from the DNA. And that would be the RNA world hypothesis, that anything in life, all the cells actually originate from RNA. Yes, those are my references. This was the topic of origin of cells, and thank you for watching. I hope you have a nice day.